story of Upbuild began in a monastery. On our quest to understand ourselves more deeply, we recognize that it is our attachment to our egos, our identities, that gets in the way of being our true selves. This podcast will help you understand your ego. It will help you better understand your inner world, the motivations, insecurities, and emotions that affect your every action and relationship. Welcome to Upbuilding the Self.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Upbuilding the Self. I am Michael Sawyer, and I am here with Rasanath and Vipin. How are you guys?
Doing well, thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, same. Thanks, Michael.
At Upbuild, we always are thinking about this question of how do we be our best selves? And one of the ways that we can be our best selves is by understanding how we impact and affect other people. And one of the ways that we have found through our work, one of the most effective ways that we have found through our work to actually understand how we're affecting other people is through a process called the 360. And the three of us have done many 360s together over the years with our organizational and individual clients. And so I'm really excited to be able to have this conversation today as we unpack the 360 process and talk about what's possible for anyone if they're truly able to hear how they are affecting other people. And Vipin, you were the one who originally brought this process to Upbuild. So could you get us started by sharing what is the 360 process and why is it so powerful?
Sure. Thank you. Well, I don't even think we called it a 360. The first time we were doing this with an organization that this is in 2016, an organization that we were coaching the founders of. And one of the realizations was there was a lot of friction between the founders and the team. And they were hearing lots of different things, but they didn't really know how to make sense of which ones, what to act on. And so we created our own process in which we interviewed. It was a small team. The team was only 12 to 15 people, something like that. And so we decided what we were going to do is interview every single person, create an interview guide with a set of questions to really understand what was their experience of the leadership team, of each particular founder, of the organization at large. And we were going to interview everyone and synthesize all of the interviews thematically and try to help present a more clear portrait of what was happening at the company. And then as we saw the value of having done that, we then sort of more formally called it it was a 360-degree review. It wasn't for an individual, but it was for an organization or a leadership team. And so that process then became somewhat of a staple since then. And also there are lots of organizations or coaching organizations that do this. Our version is a very high-touch version where we will interview, let's call it 8 to 12 people that are stakeholders in an individual's life, in their work. And so that might be peers of theirs, supervisors, direct reports, family members, friends, people who can be very thoughtful about what is my experience of this person and what can I share that they may or may not be aware of.
And what are some of the questions that we might ask in the interview?
The gist of it for me is always falls into the categories of what is going well, what's really working in your relationship with this person or in this person's impact on you, the team, the organization, and what's not. What are some of the challenges? What are some things that you've experienced that you may have been hesitant to share? And there are many different specific versions of these questions that we will ask to try to elicit anecdotes and stories to help aid the 360 process. So one example might be, if I were a fly on the wall in your board meetings, what would I observe about this person that we're talking about?
I think there are two parts to the questioning process. One part is going in with a certain standard set of questions, or more you can think of as prompts for the person to really start sharing, speaking about. Now, in my experience, a lot comes out when you pay attention, and this is why we call it a high touch 360. A lot comes out when you pay attention to how somebody is sharing a particular story or a particular piece of information. I've had many times people say or use certain words, but how they say it tells me, hey, there is more here that I need to unpack. So I might even say, hey, when you said that, I noticed that there was some resentment. I'm very curious to see if I picked up on something there. And many times people are surprised when that question is asked, and they actually step in to divulge more information and how they are personally affected. There is a very dynamic nature from a point of view of what may come as a result of some of the initial prompts that you're asking. But a lot of the powerful materials come from more spontaneous questions. What we're looking for is the convergence of challenges, right? What comes out are themes. And a lot of people will share the same themes in different ways. And a big part about the 360 is the synthesis that we do to really categorize the challenges and be able to succinctly describe this is the theme that emerged, which is very helpful for the recipient, because people may convey the same theme in many different ways, and you feel like, okay, you have to act on all of them. But when you converge, when you really see where the convergence is presented in the theme, it's just very helpful to understand it.
I really appreciate what Rasanath said. The initial questions really just form the scaffolding, and then so much of the value is in following the threads and just asking to understand a story more deeper and the impact, and then examples of these things, because the examples really make it concrete for the recipient. And obviously, with the examples, we have to take great care, because part of the premise is that the person sharing the feedback it's meant to be anonymous so that they can share as openly and as freely as possible. And so when it comes to specific examples, like, we have to take great care in terms of how those are shared. But another reason why I think people are so much more forthcoming in the 360, where it's not just a form and handwritten comments. People are quite sensitive to, okay, I'm writing this down. Who's it going to go to? Who's going to see it? It's forever captured in this way. And in a conversation where we're taking our notes, but it's going to somebody else who's not in the organization, whose job it is to synthesize and share it back in a way that's going to be really beneficial for the recipient. And the recipient is asking for this from everyone around them. It's a different experience. People are actually incredibly open. They feel like they're doing a service for the person who's receiving it. And many times through this process, one of the things I think we hear surprisingly often is, wow, that was really therapeutic. Not because they're just venting in the conversation, but they realize there's stuff that they may be holding on to, and there's now a container for them to be able to express some of the experiences that they hope will help the person, address them, get better.
So you're saying it's therapeutic for the person who is being interviewed, who's actually sharing their feedback about the other person.
Yes. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, absolutely.
And we also want to make this applicable to a really wide audience, not just people who are considering getting high touch 360s, but I'm very hopeful that there'll be a lot in here for anyone, because of the importance of being open to feedback and the fact that we can give and receive feedback basically at any time in our life. It doesn't have to be through a formal process like this. I think some examples will be really helpful. If you guys think back on the last couple of years and the different 360s that you have been through, are there any examples that stand out that really show the strength of a process like this and the impact on the person receiving the feedback?
I think the reason the 360 process is so powerful, because most people never receive the feedback that they receive in the 360 directly from the people involved, because people are sensitive about sharing feedback because they don't want to hurt or demotivate the person. Sometimes it's hard, it's uncomfortable. They hope the issue will just go away. It's not really worth going into. And as a result, the person carries on with the story that they have, and that story doesn't get corrected or disrupted with the data. So I'm thinking of, you asked about an example, one situation that both Rasanath and I were involved in many years ago. This was a founder and CEO that was very incredibly competent and successful, yet there were some challenges among the leadership team and the team at large. And the thing that, we often will do in the 360 process is at the end, when we're complete, the 360 is complete, but before we present it to the recipient, we will ask them to give us what they think. They know the people we've spoken to. So we'll ask them to tell us what you think we heard. Tell us what the themes are likely to be and what is the impact of those themes, both on things that are really going well and the challenges. And in this case, I remember that the recipient, he could identify 60, 70% of the themes, the behaviors. But what was so illuminating was that the behaviors that he was exhibiting were having the exact opposite impact of his desired impact. And you would think, like, how could he not see that? Like, if you're knowing the behavior, how could you not project what impact it may be having? But it's really hard to know, to really understand the impact on somebody else without that person telling you, sharing what they're experiencing. And people were too intimidated to share, to tell him what their experience was. And he was seeing some of the positive impact of those behaviors, of that intimidation. But it was so striking. I mean, it was this huge awakening for him to see, wow, the thing that I'm trying to develop with my team, the way I'm acting is having the exact opposite impact.
So can you bring us into the specifics? What was the feedback? And then what was he thinking was going to be the impact? And what was he actually understanding about the impact as a result of the 360?
The behaviors were to really drive like a hard driving culture around consequences for everything that happens. And so it was an environment in which, one of the classic lines for this recipient would share was, we can do it your way, but just know that you will bear the consequences if it works out or if it doesn't work out, which seems on the surface, you would say, yeah, well, isn't everyone responsible for the consequences of their choices? But the way it was done, and there was so much kind of intimidation in the presence, that how people responded was, well, I'd rather just do it your way. And then, if it doesn't work out, like, it's on you instead of it being on me. And, what came out of the 360 was you have really talented people around the founder and CEO, and yet those people aren't exercising their best talent because they are scared of the consequences of taking certain risks, and they've seen the consequences for other people. And the recipient what he was seeing is, when you have a culture where people are a little bit scared, you do get them to push really hard, to work over and above what might be normal because they are working out of fear. And so just that culture of fear, when we're talking about this out loud, again, if you're listening, it would seem like that seems fairly obvious. Like, how could someone miss the impact of the culture of fear? But when you also see everything going up and to the right, all the numbers, the growth, the scale, like, the funding, you're just like, well, yeah, sure, there might be some consequences, but things seem to be working. And I'm not really hearing about what's not working about this.
And I think that's what we often observe, is that in organizations, especially, that people try to create a certain amount of fear so that there's hard work and determination and a healthy amount of anxiety. And I think we all feel that in ourselves as well. And in fact, a lot of us carry around the story that we need that in order to
Motivate,
get motivated and work hard. And it sounds like what came out of this 360 is a clear understanding that what he was doing was actually preventing people from doing their best work because it was preventing them from taking risks and feeling like they could fail in ways and therefore weren't able to freely express themselves and do their best work.
Yeah, I mean, and not actually feeling the power of someone's hand on your back or the leader's hand on your back behind you, but instead feeling like could be quite transactional, and like as long as I'm still hitting the mark, I'm in good favor. But if that ever were to change, that could change overnight. And so then I feel like an asset instead of a person. I feel like a resource, and there are lots of impacts of that.
Okay, very good. So there's the wake-up call of I've been transactional, it's worked largely, but actually now I'm seeing the cost.
Yes, and the quotes are so powerful. So when we anonymize the feedback, we are anonymizing the names, but the emotional effect that the quotes have are still very present. So when we thematize all the feedback, we put the quotes, the relevant quotes after each theme, and that carries the the emotional weight of what people are experiencing. When you read those quotes, you really begin to see the effect of it.
Yeah, I would love to add two more things to what you just said, Rasanath, because they're so poignant for me. One is, I think that one experience people have when receiving these 360s with the actual language of the team around them is like, oh my gosh, like why haven't people told me this directly? And these are very strong words in here, and there's a wake up where like I've been working so closely, and yet I haven't heard this from people directly. And it's the wake up is you can have different reactions to that, but what we've seen often, especially as we've been with a person to guide them and even receiving the 360, is what can I do to create more of an environment so that that person will speak all of these things directly to me whenever they're experiencing them. The other thing I was going to say is in the case that we were just talking about, the founders did something so powerful that it's become almost the standard of practice for us in the 360s, where we spent time talking about how do they share this back with the team? Like what is the process where they acknowledge they've received this, and what are they going to do about it? And what they ended up doing was at their next offsite, getting up in front of their team, their executive team, and actually reading through the entire 360, all the themes, and then all the quotes. And the reaction on the other side was, wow, like what we've understood was it was almost a jaw-dropping reaction, because they'd never seen these leaders be so vulnerable, so open and so vulnerable. And it shifted the energy in that room immediately.
Yeah, it also helps people feel heard. So people understand that I gave this feedback and it didn't just go into the ether. Like it actually made it into the final product, and most importantly, it made it into the consciousness of the person receiving the feedback. This is an intense process. It takes a lot of courage to ask for one and to want one. Dan Harris, who some of our listeners will know, was an ABC News anchor, and then he's more recently wrote a book and started a meditation company. He was on the Tim Ferriss show, and Tim was asking him about a 360 that he had received from another coaching company, and he compared the 360 process to an emotional colonoscopy. Like it felt that invasive, and he had gotten one where not only were people interviewed in his work, but also his wife and his siblings and other people in his personal life. So it was really a 360 on his entire life, and it was quite intense. And I think that's what a lot of people's experience is like to see in black and white what people around me, when they're given permission to really speak in an unfiltered way for the benefit of the other person, what comes out.
Yeah. It's like, I want to know, but I don't want to know. Or I want to know as long as it's mostly good and you can make the bad stuff or the difficult stuff palatable. But there can be some rude awakenings. Absolutely.
Yeah. And if we think about just how we show up in our daily lives, we almost never go around truly inviting the people in our life to give us feedback.
Feedback is a very sensitive thing, right? Feedback is perhaps the biggest act of mirroring that we receive, whether it's at work, whether it's at home, which affects our own sense of self. And many times when we think about feedback, oh, I need to give you some feedback, and the way feedback is used, we don't necessarily understand how sensitive the process of feedback is. And for us, when we do this work, what's important is, one is it's drawing the information out. But number two is also being able to give this information in a way that's sensitive and beneficial, actually beneficial for the person receiving the feedback.
Could either of you share a little bit about the setup for the 360 to help our listeners understand how we invite that in?
First of all, when the person who is going to receive the 360 decides to embark on the 360 process, we explain the process, the 360 process, to the individual, which means, choose the people you think know you well enough in the context of work, or it can also be in a personal context. And also create a list of individuals from a spectrum, meaning that some of these people will not just say good things about you. Like, very clearly that some of these individuals you have challenges with. So include them on the list. The second part of the process, which is again very important, is the person receiving the 360 invites all these individuals to give the 360, which means they help the person send out an email, and the email is worded sincerely, even if there is intimidation around it. Well, this can be scary. But then there has to be the sincerity and the openness. And this is also such an important part of the process. The people who are invited to give feedback, they shouldn't be skeptical about the process. They shouldn't be like, well, I have tried giving feedback to this person and it doesn't really work, so I'm just not. They have to be very willing participants in the process. And the single thing that determines how willing they are is the openness of the person who's going to receive the feedback. So the conveying of the invitation is an important part. Then the third piece is when we do conduct the interviews, we essentially create a space where the person who's giving feedback can feel completely safe to be able to share very openly and honestly. The fourth part is the synthesis. So when we synthesize the 360, and we are always keeping in mind, well, how can this be best conveyed to the individual? How can we put this in a way that the individual receiving the 360 can fully understand? And at the same time, it's not just understand, but also provoked to make some changes, right? So you want to strike the right balance between the sensitivity and also genuine provocation that can lead to actual change. There has to be discontent that is created from the 360 so that change can happen. The fifth is the process of actually delivering the feedback, which is a very extended process where we have both parts. We have what is going well and what are some of the challenges. And we spend ample amount of time on both sections, because one without the other doesn't necessarily work. And the processing of it all. Again, as I said, feedback is a very sensitive thing, and it is hard as a leader, especially when you're trying to give your best. And then to receive really tough feedback can be very discouraging. So the processing of the 360, how we conduct the process, we really help the person express fully how they feel about the 360, walk them through their own journey of the receiving of the 360 itself. And this takes multiple sessions. It's not like a document sent and that's pretty much it. It takes a series of conversations. And then at the end of it, we create a plan of communicating back to the organization and actions that need to be taken based on the 360.
And just to underscore a point that you made in the setup, the sharing of the why is so important.
Absolutely. And there are we have also seen many different reasons why 360s are done, right? One reason is, well, it's an exercise that I have to go through. And so it's like a review process. Let me be done with it. The other reason is I want to show my team that I'm open. to feedback, because there might be a perception that I'm not open to feedback. So I want to change that perception. So I want to do a 360 and show them that I'm open to feedback. So the third reason might be to dissipate some tension that exists so that when I come across as a person who has heard them, and I don't want to be directly hearing from them, but if I engage somebody else to hear them, maybe I can actually dissipate the tension. Many different reasons why people employ the 360. And while there can be some benefit to all of them, it's very different when you're coming into the 360 from a place of like, I want to make a change to my life. And the people who know me, who have actually observed me very closely, are the people who are best positioned to provide me input for that change. And that spirit of invitation is what really gives the 360 all its power.
That's great. That's so important. I mean, and that's the reason why also when we conduct a 360 on behalf of someone, we make it clear to anyone involved in the process, like the only person who will receive that 360 from us will be the recipient. And if they feel like they want to share that with others, then that's completely up to them because they have to feel the inspiration to do that versus it being a tool that's being forced on someone that's really for the benefit of someone else or the organization. So I think our goal in doing the 360 is always 100% to serve the recipient of the 360. That's it.
So people get a lot of feedback, especially in the challenges section. There might be a bunch of stuff that I don't really agree with or I think is unfair. And this can also come in daily life too, when we hear feedback from other people or get a sense of how people are feeling as a result of our behaviors. What do we recommend that people do with the feedback that they feel like is unfair or not true from their perspective?
So there are multiple ways in which we can walk through that. And what's important here is it's very easy to dismiss something. It takes some courage to stay in it and understand, well, what's the truth and what's the noise? And what we have seen many times is when the feedback is given, people say, hey, this is unfair, and just dismiss the whole thing. And one of the things that we have to do with them is, well, is there a grain of truth in this? Right? So when you ask that question, the person has to look at, well, yeah, I think these parts may be true here, right? So suddenly you're shifting their relationship with what they initially felt unfair. What we're really trying to discover is what is the truth here? And when we pay attention to the truth, even when there is some noise around, what you are meant to act on is the truth. Because sometimes when people provide feedback, they're also bringing in their own emotionality to it. And that emotionality may be sometimes disproportionate to what might actually be happening. Now, our tendency is then to dismiss the whole feedback without really understanding, well, what is the truth here and how do I need to act on the truth?
Do you have any examples to help illustrate this, either from a 360 or maybe from your personal life where you have received some feedback?
It's the same company that Vipin had given the example earlier. One of the founders of this company had a very similar reaction, basically said, this is unfair, what people are saying. And the resistance, so this is the other thing that I also have to be sensitive to. At that moment, what I personally felt, and I am his coach, was the resistance to that feedback was just so high that at that moment, I felt that engaging with that would just make it harder for the person to understand what the truth here is. So at that moment, I had to take the stance of asking the person, okay, so let's park this. Let's see what you need to act on first, and let's work with that. But then I always had that piece of information in my back pocket. And in subsequent coaching sessions, I kept bringing it back again and again and again. And then 2 years after the feedback was done, and when the person had dismissed that as being unfair, the person actually said, you know what, now I see what they were actually saying.
I really appreciate the story you shared and the patience that you held as the sort of over a couple of years with that particular feedback. I think, like for me, if I were to simplify this idea of you're receiving feedback that feels painful or that you don't agree with. Like, part of, I think, what we advise is first to not do anything, just to sit with it, to see, because even, your relationship with that piece of feedback changes the first time you see it, after an hour, overnight. Like, just being able to bring more awareness to this is what other people are experiencing. So start with just like that sitting with, and then I think there's inquiry. How do I inquire, like what Rasanath's suggesting about, okay, where's the truth here in this? Or even if this were entirely true, what would I do with that? Well, how would I feel about it? If this is the experience of someone, what can I do? But it takes some internal inquiry. And I think they're writing and processing with coach, processing with other trusted people, writing yourself, so that we don't avoid, because sometimes like that feedback, it reminds us of something and we just want to like brush it under the rug. And so we don't actually deal with the emotions around this feels painful or I don't agree with.
So we don't necessarily need to address it or completely understand it right away. I like what you shared, Vipin, about I just kind of do nothing originally when I receive it and just let it affect me. Also, what you shared reminded me of another reframe that we often offer to people when they're receiving feedback. Rather than asking the question, is this true? Asking the question, how is this true?
Such a good reframing.
One of the pitfalls we see in a 360 process is the recipient gets the 360, and in the, immediately they're like, I know what I can do about this, this, and this. Like they start, it's such an aggressive problem-solving, solution orientation. It's like, I'm not even letting the waves of the impact like wash over me. I just immediately get to solving. And part of the shift that needs to happen with the 360 is it's an awareness shift. And so slowing down, we always talk about slow. If you're a race car driver and slow around the curves, like there are a lot of curves in a 360, and to be able to slow, making sure I really understand, focusing on understanding versus immediate action. We will get to action, but if the action is based on a deeper understanding, it's going to be all that much more powerful versus it being more superficial. Like, I know how to address this quote that I'm seeing, and like, I'm just going to start doing that right now.
So we've spoken about how we can't tackle all of this feedback at the same time. And yet we don't want to let feedback go unaddressed. So how do we balance those two?
This is so important. Well, one of the things we do is part of the moving to action planning, co-creating an action plan, is prioritization. And when we write the 360, when we deliver it, we have, from our perspective, prioritized what we think are the most important challenges to address from our perspective. But what we want to do when we sit down is like, think about this whole 360. What are the first one or two things that you want to address? There may be 10 challenges in there, but what are the one or two things? Because you can't tackle everything. And it's so important to be focused and make progress in one or two areas versus feeling overwhelmed with all of it. And the other thing that we've seen is a lot of these challenges are typically interconnected. And so when you make progress on one, you will see ripple effects on many of the others. And so what we like to do is let's choose the one we're going to start with. Let's think about one or two actions that this person is willing to commit to, that think will address what it is, what the feedback is saying. And then let's come back. Let's figure out, how are we going to measure what time, over what timeline, and then come back a month or 2 months later, look at it again and say, okay, has this been sufficiently shifted? Can we take on the next piece? And also letting the participants know this is how I'm approaching it. And so also, if I'm saying this is what I'm planning to do, this is what I'm committing to do, participants in that 360 might be able to share, this sounds great. Can we also suggest X or Y? So it's done in connection and collaboration, not in isolation, where it's like, okay, they've told me this, I have a plan, I'm going to do this. Well, obviously, when we are involved, it'll be done in collaboration with a coach, but also you want it to be in connection with the people that are giving you the feedback.
So it's a combination of both prioritization and transparency about the prioritization. And what we talked about earlier is people really feeling understood and heard in the feedback. So if the person receiving it is able to reflect back, here are the 5 or 10 things that I've heard, but I'm actually only going to start with these 2. That can go a long way to creating the trust and the feeling that I've heard what you've shared, and this is my plan to start tackling it.
Yeah, especially if you start seeing a shift in that one or those 1 or 2 things. So there's prioritization in terms of, here are the set of issues to address. I'm going to prioritize these 1 or 2. And then within that, there might be 100 actions that you could take. I'm going to, again, prioritize what 1 or 2 things will have the most leverage and I can really commit to. So there's kind of multiple layers of prioritization that happen within that. And then, I think the transparency. So there's prioritization and then action and transparency of both the prioritization and the action.
Right. And we can break trust at any point along those 3 things. So it's important that we are following through with all 3 of them. So as we start to bring this conversation to a close, if I'm listening to this and this feels interesting, what are some steps that I might take, whether it be a high touch 360 or some more lower touch options?
We tend to think of ourselves as people, and this is something that I have reflected on my own sense of being. We tend to think of ourselves as like, I'm a very open person. I'm just very open. Embarking on a 360 really, and a genuinely sincere 360 process tests how open we truly are. And when I say open, what it means is our capacity to be able to receive what people experience from us, and to be, again, going back to that, to be able to understand what the truth in it is. And then how can that contribute to me growing as an individual? That kind of openness, if you're not working on that openness muscle, we actually are pretty closed. And to me, this is an invitation to really work on that openness muscle, to really be open to receiving what is true. So a simple way to start this process is choose 1 or 2 people in your life who you know well. And just very honestly ask them, hey, what is going well, what is not? And while you are asking them the question, be sincere and just make notes. You're not making sense of it as you're writing it down. You just receive. And then, as Vipin said, sit with it and then decide what do you need to do about it. It is such a shifting process. It's a life-shifting process. Even if you're able to do it with 1 or 2 individuals, truly tests how open we are, really.
For the benefit of our people listening and not watching, you just had a very big smile on your face while Rasanath was talking. So I was wondering if you could bring us into why the smile.
I think I know the source of the smile, which I'll share in a second. Just like Michael, you had shared about the importance of the why I'm doing this. So obviously, if you're going to reach out to a couple of people and invite their feedback, you'll have to give them some context or what your intention is around the whole thing and why you're going through and what you're hoping to learn from that type of exercise. But I think the part of the reason I was smiling is I was thinking about this idea of inviting feedback, right? And when do we do it? So yes, you have a very formal 360 process we've talked about. But how can, Michael, you mentioned this earlier, like we have an opportunity to invite feedback all the time of any sort. And I was smiling when I was just thinking about how, I've even been very explicit with myself, how like I invite that feedback when I feel really good about how I'm doing. And so, it's like, classically when I feel like I've just delivered something big, I would then have the conversation with my boss about promotion. Should we talk about promotion or my salary? And feedback is the same way. It's like I'm ready on the back of like feeling like I have like the wind at my back in my sales and things are going well. What is it? I know for myself when I just feel like I really messed something up, I had a very difficult interaction with someone, that is the last point in time that I want to go ask for invite feedback. I'll just let me wait till things are smoothed over, that things are like in a better spot, and then let me invite. What is that pointing to? It's like, I can't face the music. I don't want to. I'd rather stick my head in the sand and just be like, things are fine. I'll recover. I'll make up for this. And now, like, what does that mean? I really just want people to tell me you're doing okay. You're okay, Vipin. Things are good. And I think part of what we're talking about here, I mean, the thing that's amazing about a 360 process, you don't really have that luxury. I mean, sure, you could wait till you delivered something great and be like, now let's do the 360, but it's coming from such a wide, diverse group of people who had very different interactions. Like, you're going to get something challenging in that process. And I think when you're thinking about doing it on your own, I would try my best to now, when I have something like that, something difficult, like that's the moment. Say like, hey, this was not a great interaction. Can we talk about it? I mean, that becomes a very specific feedback about an interaction versus more broadly. But I think, I mean, why I was smiling and I was thinking, can we invite feedback? Can we ask for it when we're not feeling great? Because that often presents, we have to do it with people that we trust, can be sensitive and can be doing this from our benefit, because that also leaves us quite vulnerable to, what somebody else might say. But I think in seeking the truth, as Rasanath has mentioned a couple times in this conversation, it's so important to not bias ourselves to situations when we feel will give us a certain angle on how we're doing. So that's why I was smiling.
Thank you. Rasanath, I feel the need to prompt you for the C.S. Lewis truth versus comfort right now. Would you mind sharing that with us?
Yes. If you want to be comfortable, you'll never find the truth. But if you want to know the truth, you will eventually become comfortable. Is the quote. We're still finding the source of it. I'm still trying to track it down. But that is the difference. Many times we approach a 360 from a point of view of wanting comfort more than wanting the truth. The truth eventually, if we can find it and accept, then it will eventually give us comfort, which is and that's why the way I understand the 360, one very, very well done 360 gives you a lifetime worth of things to really work on.
I love that. I couldn't agree more about a lifetime of work in this one document. And that's invaluable.
Okay. So in closing, is there anything that you'd like to share?
A well-done 360 gives us a lifetime worth of material to work on. It's a manual. It sort of becomes a manual where we can really refer back to and see what do we need to do to grow. It's invaluable to receive feedback, especially from individuals who know us and have known us for a very long time in any context.
The last thing I would say is just to reinforce this point that I think a 360 is an exercise in seeking truth. And that is not to say that somebody else has the absolute truth and I don't have, but I have my stories of whatever it is that's happening in my perceptions. And by broadening that to understand the experiences and the impacts on other people who are around me, who are dear to me, who I care about, it's expanding my lens from just my story to the stories and the experiences and the perceptions of those around me. And so I'm getting closer to what is something that might resemble more of an objective reality than the one that just might be coming from me. And I think if you care about that, if you care about seeking the truth of a relationship or situation, then you must do this. You must seek this type of feedback, whether it's in a 360 or otherwise. And like the point Rasanath shared, like it's a lifetime of growth. What are we working on? How do we always care so much about working on ourselves? Well, it gives you a lot of fodder to know where to point yourself.
Beautiful. Well, thank you both for sharing in this conversation. I'm really taking away with a re-inspired feeling that I want to understand the truth. And I also want to use this opportunity to invite both of you, as I do from time to time, to share any feedback with me, not while we're recording, but please know that even if I pretend like I don't want any feedback, I actually do, because it's what I need for my long-term growth and benefit. And I'm very grateful to have you both in my life for that.
Likewise. I also deeply believe that the two of you and people who work at Upbuild deeply care about my benefit, which sometimes I tell this to Hari Prasad. I think that the team cares about me more than I can actually care about myself, which I very deeply trust.
Thank you so much, Michael, Rasanath.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you for listening to Upbuilding the Self. Upbuild is a leadership development company that offers workshops, coaching, and other services to help you on the path towards being your best self, free from the shackles of the ego. To learn more about our work, visit our website, upbuild.com, and sign up for our newsletter to gain access to podcasts, reflections, and upcoming events. If you enjoyed this episode, please go to iTunes to leave us a review so that others can find and benefit from the podcast. We look forward to being with you again next time.